The rain fell in a relentless drizzle, casting a veil of mist over the quiet suburban neighborhood. As the streetlights flickered to life, their feeble glow cast elongated shadows that danced across the wet pavement. Anne sat by her window, the rhythmic sound of raindrops against the glass providing a soothing backdrop to her thoughts. Despite the peaceful ambiance, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. It had been building for days, a sense that she was being watched. She dismissed it at first, attributing it to her overactive imagination. But the unease persisted, growing stronger with each passing night. Anne's gaze shifted to the house across the street. It had been vacant for as long as she could remember. Its windows were boarded up, and its garden had become an unruly thicket of overgrown plants. The house was like a forgotten memory, a relic of the past that had faded into the background. However, something was different tonight. A faint light flickered in one of the windows, a glimmer that seemed out of place in the abandoned house. Anne's heart quickened, her unease transforming into curiosity. She watched intently, her breath caught in her throat as a figure materialized in the window. It was a man, his face obscured by the shadows. He stood perfectly still, his gaze fixed on Anne's house. Despite the rain and darkness, Anne felt an unsettling connection, as though their eyes had locked across the distance. Trepidation mingled with curiosity, and Anne's instincts screamed at her to look away, to retreat from the intensity of the gaze that held her captive. But she couldn't tear her eyes from the man's figure, his presence casting a haunting spell that froze her in place. Minutes stretched into an eternity before the man finally turned away from the window and disappeared into the depths of the house. Anne exhaled a shaky breath, her heart still racing from the encounter. She tried to convince herself that it was a mere coincidence, that her imagination had conjured a sinister presence where none existed. With a determined shake of her head, Anne turned away from the window and attempted to immerse herself in a book. The rain continued its gentle symphony, but the unease lingered, a relentless itch in the back of her mind. She tried to push aside her apprehensions, but her thoughts kept returning to the figure in the abandoned house. As the night wore on, sleep remained elusive. Anne's mind was a battleground between rationality and fear, each side vying for dominance. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her, and she drifted into an uneasy slumber. When Anne awoke, the first rays of dawn were peeking through her curtains. She felt a mixture of relief and disappointment that the night had passed without incident. She tried to dismiss the previous night's events as a trick of her imagination, a manifestation of her anxieties. Determined to regain her sense of normalcy, Anne got ready for the day ahead. She left her house, her footsteps echoing in the quiet morning. Her route took her past the abandoned house, and she couldn't help but glance at it, half expecting to see the figure from last night in the window once again. To her surprise, the front door of the abandoned house stood slightly ajar. The unease that had been simmering within her flared to life once more. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before finally summoning the courage to approach the house. Every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down Anne's spine as she ventured further inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by thin slivers of light that filtered through the boarded windows. The air was heavy with the musty scent of neglect. "Hello?" Anne's voice quivered as she called out, her words swallowed by the silence. No response came, but the sense of being watched was stronger than ever. Anne's heart raced, her senses on high alert. She explored the ground floor cautiously, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. As Anne ascended a creaky staircase, the feeling of unease intensified. She reached the landing and paused, her breath catching in her throat. The door to one of the bedrooms was ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. With hesitant steps, Anne approached the room. A sense of foreboding settled over her as she pushed the door open, revealing a sight that made her blood run cold. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center, and on that chair sat a photograph. Anne's heart pounded as she picked up the photograph, her hands trembling. It depicted a family, a father, a mother, and a little girl. Their smiles were frozen in time, a stark contrast to the haunting ambiance of the abandoned house. But what sent a chill down Anne's spine was the realization that the man from the photograph bore a striking resemblance to the figure she had seen in the window last night. A shiver raced down Anne's spine as a whisper of intuition gripped her. She felt as though the walls held secrets, as though the abandoned house held memories that longed to be uncovered. But the truth that lay within those walls was far more sinister than she could have imagined. As Anne stood in that dimly lit room, she heard a sound, a faint, distant creak. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone in the house. Someone else was there with her, someone who shared the same spaces, the same air. The door to the room slowly swung shut, the sound of its movement echoing in the stillness. Anne's heart raced, her mind racing to find an explanation. Was it the wind? Or was there someone else in the house? Panicked, Anne rushed to the door and pulled it open, her gaze sweeping the hallway beyond. There was no sign of movement, no indication that anyone else was there. But the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever, a malevolent presence that seemed to envelop her. With each step, the house seemed to close in around Anne, its walls suffocatingly close. The shadows danced on the periphery of her vision, whispering secrets she couldn't comprehend. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, to escape the grasp of the unsettling atmosphere. And then, from the corner of her eye, Anne saw movement. She turned, her heart pounding, to find herself face to face with the man from the photograph. His eyes bore into hers, a mixture of sadness and longing in his gaze. Fear paralyzed Anne as the man took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. She wanted to scream, to flee from the nightmare that had enveloped her reality. But her voice was trapped, suffocated by the weight of her terror. The man extended a trembling hand, his expression pleading. Anne felt a surge of compassion, an inexplicable connection that defied reason. She couldn't explain why, but she knew that this man, this restless spirit, needed something from her. Summoning her courage, Anne reached out and touched the man's hand. A rush of emotions flooded over her: sadness, regret, and a desperate yearning for closure. The man's presence seemed to soften, his ethereal form flickering like a candle in the wind. And then, in a burst of light, the man vanished, leaving Anne standing alone in the abandoned house. The atmosphere that had been suffocating suddenly lifted, replaced by a profound sense of emptiness. Anne stumbled out of the house, her heart still racing from the encounter. She couldn't explain what had just happened, the inexplicable connection she had felt with a ghost from the past. But one thing was certain: the abandoned house was no longer just a forgotten relic. It was a place that held the echoes of a tragedy long buried. As Anne walked away from the house, the rain began to fall once more, washing away the remnants of her unsettling encounter. The streetlights cast elongated shadows on the wet pavement, and Anne couldn't help but glance back at the abandoned house one last time. The rain fell in a relentless drizzle, casting a veil of mist over the quiet suburban neighborhood. But this time, Anne's unease had transformed into a profound understanding that even in the midst of the unknown and the unsettling, there was a chance for closure, for the restless spirits of the past to find solace. And as she walked away, Anne knew that the shadows that had haunted her had not only kept her up at night, but had also led her to a truth that transcended the boundaries of the living and the dead. Anne couldn't shake the memory of the ghostly encounter in the abandoned house. It lingered in her thoughts like a haunting melody, tugging at her curiosity and unsettling her sense of normalcy. She spent days researching the history of the neighborhood, digging into records to uncover the truth behind the figure from the photograph. Her search led her to a local historian who revealed the chilling tale of a family that had once lived in the very house that had captured Anne's attention. The father had been consumed by an obsessive need to protect his family, even after his own demise. Rumors of his suspicious behavior had circulated, casting a shadow over the once peaceful neighborhood. The more Anne learned about the family's tragic history, the more she felt a deep empathy for the restless spirit she had encountered. She couldn't ignore the feeling that he was reaching out to her, seeking a resolution that had eluded him in life. Armed with determination and newfound purpose, Anne set out to uncover the truth and bring closure to the spirit that had haunted her. As Anne delved deeper into her investigation, she connected with the family's surviving relatives. They shared stories of a man consumed by paranoia, his obsession driving a wedge between him and his loved ones. Anne discovered that the man's overprotective nature had led to a series of tragic events, ultimately resulting in his own demise. Haunted by guilt and unable to move on, the spirit of the man had become trapped in the house he had once called home. Anne's heart ached for him, and she was determined to help him find the peace he so desperately sought. Armed with information and a growing connection to the past, Anne returned to the abandoned house. She stood in the same room where she had encountered the spirit, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and empathy. With a steady voice, she spoke to the empty room, addressing the spirit by name and acknowledging his pain. "I know you're here," she said softly, her voice carrying a sense of compassion. "I know you're still searching for something that's keeping you tied to this place. But it's time to let go, to find the peace you deserve." The atmosphere seemed to shift, the air growing still as Anne's words hung in the silence. And then, as if in response, a faint flicker of light danced in the corner of the room. Anne's heart raced as the spirit's presence grew stronger, a palpable energy that enveloped her. Tears welled in Anne's eyes as she continued to speak, sharing the family's story and acknowledging the pain that had bound the spirit to the house. With each word, the flickers of light grew brighter, and Anne could almost sense the spirit's presence beside her. As Anne's voice faded, a feeling of profound stillness settled over the room. The atmosphere seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a moment that transcended time and reality. And then, with a final burst of light, the spirit's presence vanished, leaving behind an empty room that felt lighter somehow. Anne stood there for a moment, her heart full of both sadness and relief. She felt a sense of connection to the past, a bond that had allowed her to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. As she left the abandoned house behind, she knew that she had played a role in bringing closure to a long-forgotten tragedy. Months passed, and the neighborhood returned to its quiet, peaceful state. The rain fell once again, casting gentle ripples on the surface of puddles. Anne often glanced at the abandoned house as she walked by, but the windows remained dark and lifeless. One evening, as Anne sat by her window, she noticed a faint light flicker in the window of the abandoned house. It was different this time, a warm, inviting glow that seemed to beckon. Anne's heart skipped a beat as she watched, a mixture of trepidation and hope welling within her. And then, to her amazement, a figure appeared in the window, not the haunting presence she had encountered before, but a figure bathed in light and radiating a sense of peace. It was the same man, but his expression was no longer one of sadness. It was one of gratitude and serenity. As their eyes met across the distance, Anne smiled, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. And then, with a final flicker of light, the figure vanished, leaving behind a sense of closure, and the knowledge that sometimes the lines between the living and the dead can be blurred in the most unexpected and profound ways.